This morning we are continuing our study in the book of Acts, and we are at Acts 17 verses 16 through 34. While Paul waited for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to find that the city was flooded with idols. He began to interact with the Jews and Gentile God worshippers in the synagogue. He also addressed whoever happened to be in the marketplace each day. Certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers engaged him in discussion too. Some said, "What an amateur! What's he trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods." They said this because he was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. They took him into custody and brought him to the council on Mars Hill. "What is this new teaching? Can we learn what you're talking about? You've told us some strange things, and we want to know what they mean." They said this because all Athenians, as well as the foreigners who live in Athens, used to spend their time doing nothing but talking about or listening to the newest things. Paul stood up in the middle of the council on Mars Hill and said, "People of Athens, I see that you are very religious in every way. As I was walking through town and carefully observing your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What you worship as unknown, I now proclaim to you. God, who made the world and everything in it, is Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in temples made with human hands. Nor is God served by human hands as though he needed something, since he is the one who gives life, breath, and everything else. From one person, God created every human nation to live on the whole earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands. God made the nations so they would seek him, perhaps even reach out to him and find him. In fact, God isn't far away from any of us. In God we live, move, and exist. As some of your own poets said, we are his offspring. Therefore, as God's offspring, we have no need to imagine that the divine being is like a gold, silver, or stone image made by human skill and thought. God overlooks ignorance of these things in past times, but now directs everyone everywhere to change their hearts and lives. And this is because God has set a day when he intends to judge the world justly by a man he has appointed. God has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection from the dead, some began to ridicule Paul. Others, however, said, We'll hear from you about this again." At that, Paul left the council. Some people joined him and came to believe, including Dionysius, a member of the council on Mars Hill, a woman named Damaris, and several others. "600 years before the birth of Christ, there was a terrible, horrendous, mysterious plague that decimated the great city of Athens. Compared to the wave of the disease Ebola that we're currently struggling with in parts of the world, Ebola is a minor flare-up compared to what was happening in Athens and the surrounding area, where thousands and thousands of people were dying, and there was absolutely no end in sight to this terrible plague. So the city leaders got together and they decided that they needed to do something, and that what the problem probably was that there was some god that they had offended. But they didn't know which god it was that they had offended. So they decided to bring in an outside consultant to help them discover what it was that they had done to offend the god. What was it? or which god was it they had offended? Was it Zeus or Apollo or Athena or Poseidon or the lovely Aphrodite or any of the other hundreds of deities that you learned about in your 9th grade literature class? Recognizing the enormity of the task of discernment, the city leaders brought in a man from Cyprus named Epimenides. And Epimenides arrived on the scene, and he walked around and started talking with people and started looking at all of the altars and looking at all of the statues, all of the gods that the Athenians worship. And he came to his conclusion fairly quickly, and he told them none of the gods were causing the plague. It must therefore be some unknown god that was causing this terrible plague. Epimenides proposed a solution. He had the Athenians take a flock of choice sheep, which they kept hungry for several days, and then he had the sheep turned loose on Mars Hill, which at that time was a very lush pasture area, an open area, and they watched all of those sheep really carefully. And they watched to see which of the sheep might possibly lie down in the pasture without eating anything. Even though they were hungry, and even though this was prime grazing area. Several of the sheep, much to the amazement of those who were on watch duty, several of the sheep actually sat down and they lay down in the pasture and they didn't eat. So at the spots where those sheep lay down, they erected altars. And they dedicated the altars to an unknown god. And then on those altars, the sheep which lay in that spot was sacrificed. And almost immediately, we are told, the plague ended. So all around Mars Hill there remained in Paul's time, 600 years later when he was there visiting, there were these altars that were dedicated to the unknown God. Remnants of that episode. So flash forward 600 years. We've been talking about what it means to be a witness. And in Acts 17 we have yet another case study of the ever-expanding witness of this first century church. The Apostle Paul shows up in Athens, right? It was not a part of his original plan to go see the great city of Athens. But that's kind of how it is, isn't it? That when we're on assignment from God, we often, if not usually, end up in a spot that was not on our original itinerary. Paul had this clear and compelling vision of ministry in Macedonia, right? He had had a vision, a dream of a Macedonian man saying, "Come, help us, come, help us." So he goes to Macedonia, and what does he? Well, it's not who responds. Some women respond in Macedonia, and the cities kick him out. And his friends snuck him down to Athens. The two previous cities where he's preaching, Thessalonica and Berea, they were not very open to the gospel, and so the friends took Paul and his compatriots down to Athens to where so they could chill while things were cooling down in the rest of Macedonia, and they figured, well, Athens is a big city, right? There's no one that's going to hassle them or be looking for them in Athens. They'll be able to lay low in Athens. They won't have any problems. And you think, yeah, right, dream on. Would Paul be able to lay low anywhere? So while in Athens, Paul takes the 2-bit walking tour. Athens was the great architectural capital of the Western world, and so there was actually a whole lot to see in Athens. And anyway, as he's going along, he can't help but noticing all of the idols and the altars that dot the streets. And actually, he does more than notice. Verse 16 in Acts 17 says, he was deeply distressed to find that the city was flooded with idols. He was deeply distressed. I remember walking around Singapore on my first night there. And I was already in a bit of shock because I was coming from Guam, where things are totally chaotic. Guam is this messy island, and nothing is in order, and things are falling apart, and it's just crazy. And I had been there for a year without leaving the island, and then gone to Singapore for some meetings, and landed and discovered that the whole city was like a manicured Disneyland. So went from the extremes of a messy place to an overly messy place to an overly orderly place. It was just kind of shock to the system to be making that kind of a transition. Except that in Singapore, every few hundred feet there are shrines and idols with altars. Shrines for Buddha, shrines for Hindu gods. And as you're walking around, even though everything seems orderly and it seems like it's Disneyland, there are all these, it's somewhat disconcerting to see all of this that's going on around you. And so I can relate to Paul's distress in all of this. And to make a long story short, unlike me, Paul finds a soapbox and he begins to debate with the locals, starting with verse 18. Certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers engaged him in discussion too. Some said, what an amateur, or more literally, what a bird brain. What's he trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods. They said this because he was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. They took him into custody and brought him to the council on Mars Hill. What is this new teaching? Can we learn what you're talking about? You've told us some very strange things, and we want to know what you mean by them. And they said this because all of the Athenians, as well as the foreigners who lived in Athens, used to spend their time doing nothing but playing on the internet and talking and listening to the latest and newest thing. The Epicureans were the educated class of people. They were the upper class of the people that lived in Athens. They were the people with a lot of extra free time on their hands. They seem to be, philosophically, they seem to be very similar to that of the deists. You know what a deist is, right? It's someone who believes that there is, if there is a God, he's currently uninvolved in the universe and is thus mostly irrelevant. Thomas Jefferson was America's most famous deist, and a lot of the founding fathers were deists. They talked God language, they believed that there was a God, but their understanding, as you pick them apart, you start to realize what they're really saying is that God is not so much involved in the everyday activities of the world. That's kind of what Epicureans believed as well. And Epicureans believe that anything in life worth knowing is known absolutely and only through the senses. That is, through hearing, through seeing, through touching, through experiencing. Thus we have our idiom, Epicurean delight, which is the English power phrase of the day for those that are trying to grab onto the language. It means, an Epicurean delight it means that there's an overwhelming, delightful sensation associated with this, often of food. The purpose of life for an Epicurean is always going to be pleasure. and the elimination of all physical and emotional disturbance. Stoics, on the other hand, were way more popular back in the day. The Stoics were the traditionalists. They believed in the gods of the pantheon, and they opposed unbridled pleasure. They were not easily swayed by emotionalism. They were Stoic. Nor were they keen on any kinds of new ideas, and every time somebody planted a new idea in the culture, they felt somewhat obligated to pick it apart, to challenge it, to challenge the new and the up-and-coming philosophies that all of these Epicureans and other people would bring to the plaza. They would go after them. That was how Stoics saw their lot in life. They were the conservatives. They were trying to conserve the status quo and block these new ideas that were coming into society. As a matter of fact, the charge that is leveled here at Paul and at the council was that Paul was advocating strange and new deities. That was the exact same charge that the Stoics leveled against Socrates in Plato's book, The Apology. You remember that from your philosophy class? And what I want you to see is that Paul suddenly finds himself in a whole new world. As the prophecy of Acts 1:8 takes him to the end of the earth. No longer is Paul, no longer are the apostles talking to Jews. No longer are they talking to sympathetic Gentiles who believe in the one God who is involved with his people. No longer are the world's or the words of the Hebrew prophets familiar to the listeners. No longer is the possibility of a resurrected life, a resurrected body, considered to be a sane idea whatsoever. Reasonable people wouldn't even talk about that kind of nonsense. Athens represented a whole new way of thinking. There was a cross-cultural barrier at a whole new level. And Paul actually, as we're reading in here, is struggling to explain the gospel. And he's tripping over his words. He had bumped into this cross-cultural wall. Not unlike what I often bump into and encounter if I'm in a classroom and I'm talking to a group full of Micronesians and I'm trying to explain this idea or whatever, and I get a blank look. People just stare at me and I know what they're thinking. They're thinking, what is this crazy American yammering about? And why is he yammering about it? And why is he talking so fast? And why is he talking so loud? And why is he putting so much energy into this? It actually makes me feel good to see Paul struggling to make sense of all of this. You see, it's not easy explaining the gospel to someone from with a different frame of reference. I mean, have you ever had that experience where you're talking about Jesus, you're talking about the power of the cross, you're talking about the resurrection, and to somebody, and they look at you like you're from some other planet. This guy's a real religious nut. Paul was not making much sense to these people, but he didn't make any sense to them. They didn't understand what he was talking about, but he was intriguing. And they had some free time, so they enjoyed an intriguing, knockdown, flaming, internet-style debate. Some of the people decided to take him to the granddaddy of all debate forums, which was the Areopagus, which is Athens' famous council where philosophical matters were routinely discussed and debated. And in spite of his muddled presentation, Paul gets an audience with the leaders and the philosophers of the city. And as he stands in the Areopagus, Paul realizes that he's going to have to go back to square one. He's going to have to do God 101 if he's ever going to explain the gospel to these people, because their frame of reference was so completely different from his own. You know, sometimes you have to do that, especially in our post-Christian culture, in our post-Christian world, where you have to drop the familiar religious jargon that you understand and put things in simple language, in common language, maybe even in compromising language. And that's not always easy, so we're tempted to not try. It's very tempting to not try, to not put the energy into it, to not get creative about it. I mean, the Athenians were on a completely different wavelength than anything that Paul had ever encountered or experienced before. They were speaking a totally different language, even though they were speaking Greek, and Paul was a Greek speaker. They were speaking a different cultural language. And he begins, verse 22, he begins by building a bridge. He says, "People of Athens, I see that you are very religious in every way. As I was walking through town and carefully observing your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.'" And of course, everyone in the Areopagus knows exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about one of those 600-year-old altars, an altar to a God who has been a mystery all of these years. You see, by the grace of God, there are always ways to connect with even the most distant of people and groups. And that's the key point of this work. By the grace of God, there are always ways to connect with even the most distant of people and groups. There are points of connection. There are bridges with every individual and every culture. As missionaries, we know that God has already been at work there long before we arrive. And this is true in the lives of individuals. It is true in the lives of communities. It's true with whole groups of people groups. When missionaries arrived in Central America and they began to work with the great Inca peoples, they found that the Incas already had in their culture hymns to the God who had created all things. When missionaries began working with the Mbaka people in the Central African Republic, they found that these people were already worshiping a god named Koro. And they had a folklore about Koro that had been passed along verbally from generation to generation, that Koro, the creator, sent word to our forefathers long ago that he has already sent his son into the world to accomplish something wonderful for all mankind. Later, however, our forefathers turned away from the truth about Koro's son. Their legend even predicted that some white-skinned people would eventually come as messengers of Koro's son. The Mbakas had the legend of Koro. The Incas had their hymns. The Athenians had their altar to the unknown God. 600 years before Paul was to stand in the Areopagus, God had prepared a way for him to explain the gospel. God had been creating that portal. He had been creating that entry point 600 years before Paul got there. And in the case of the Athenians, it was the beginning point where the Greeks worshipped many gods, and the gospel recognizes but one God. Paul says, "You've been worshiping him without knowing who he is, and now I wish to tell you about him." And in making his presentation, Paul builds a very basic introduction to who God is. Look for the bridge that is always going to be there when you're having the discussion. Look for the bridge that is always going to be there, and then do not be afraid to start with the basics. As a matter of fact, that might actually be the best place to start 90% of the time. Remember that in 2014, you are most likely going to be sharing Christ with people who not only lack religious vocabulary, but they have not sat through 3,000 sermons. They have not been through 800 years of Sunday school classes. They have not been to Tuesday morning Bible study groups. They have not been in any Bible study groups. They have not been to Young Life Camp. They have not gone through confirmation. They have not gone through special seminars. They don't have the same framework for processing the gospel. And this is becoming more important to understand, even in Western cultures. We live in a world that is changing extremely fast, especially when it comes to spirituality. In many ways, our world today in 2014 it more closely resembles the ancient world of Athens or Corinth or Thessalonica than it does of the United States in the 1940s and the 1950s. The generation that grew up before me either accepted the gospel or they didn't accept the gospel, but they knew what the gospel was. Either you were religious or you were not religious. But now we live in a world where people aren't quite sure how to define what that means. I mean, they make up their own religion. They develop their own personalized spirituality. We've got designer spirituality. It's kind of like a smorgasbord where you walk along and you take the things off the table that you like, or maybe there's some stuff on the table that you're not quite so sure about, but you would like to experience just so that you can say that you have had it. It's kind of like lutefisk at Christmas. Nobody really likes it, but they want to experience it. And in the process, some of the basics, the staples of who God is, gets left off the plate for many people. Well, look at what Paul had to do in talking with the Athenians. And these were intellectually astute people. These were the smart people. What does he have to do? He goes back to the basics. So let's look at the basics. 5 of them. First of all, number 1, he says God is creator. God is creator. Verse 24, God who made the world and everything in it is Lord of heaven and earth. Verse 25, nor is God served by human hands as though he needed something, since he is the one who gives life, breath, and everything else. Verse 26, from one person God created every human nation to live on the whole earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands. Now, in our time, many people are inclined to look at the world in terms of some grand accident. But the Athenians knew that there was someone behind it, although they wouldn't quite say that it was someone, they would say someone's. But I mean, in the Greek worldview, there was a Father Heaven and a Mother Earth who gave birth to the gods, and they were really, the gods in their system were really oversized humans. They were glorified humans, right? Who lived a soap opera type of existence. And Paul is saying to these people who had that frame of reference, we're talking about a whole new realm here. We're talking about a whole different way of looking at this thing. This is the God who created everything, including the people. Look at the world around you. Look at the sunset. Look at the mountains. Look at the intricacy of the human body, the wonders of the islands. We're talking about the God who stands behind all of this, and thus he cannot be confined by it. He is not confined by the creation because he is the creator. Number 2, God is transcendent. God is transcendent. That's Transcendent. Transcendent. Transcendent means that he cannot be confined. He is not limited. He rises above all restrictions that you might want to place on him. So verse 24, God who made the world and everything in it is Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in temples made with human hands, nor is God served by human hands as though he needed something. The Greek gods were all very needy. They were dependent on the affection of other gods or even mortals. Most of all, they had the need to manipulate and to control each other. But this isn't how the unknown God is, Paul says. We're talking about a God who transcends all human ideas, who transcends all of these kinds of limited restrictions. Thirdly, God is the sustainer. God is the sustainer. Verse 25, since he is the one who gives life, breath, and everything else. That is, God is not sustained by our attention. God is not sustained by our appeasing sacrifices. God does not live on our praise. Quite the opposite. God is the one who sustains. He's the one who holds everything together. And this is a bit of a poke at the Epicureans who believed, like the deists, that God is distant from the world. That we sustain, they would say, we sustain the world with the help of whatever gods there might possibly be, even though they're distant. You know, we sustain the world, you sustain your own world, you create your own world. Perhaps he created it, but that was like winding up an old-fashioned clock and then just letting it run out on its own. That's kind of the theist metaphor. But Paul says, God not only gives life and breath to everything, he continues to meet the needs of the world. We're talking about a God who is involved. He's not just involved in the course of human events, but he's involved in our own lives as well. God is involved in your life. He sustains you. And this is why we pray, give us today our daily bread. We recognize that he is the source of the bread. He is the source of the daily sustenance that we need. Sure, you work for your bread, but he's the one who makes the grain grow. He's the one who sends the rain. He's the one who sends the sunshine. He's the one who gives the warmth. His sustaining hand is always behind every single thing that we receive. Fourth, God is sovereign and omnipotent. God is sovereign and omnipotent. Is omnipotent the blank there? Was sovereign?
Sovereign.
Yeah, sovereign. S-O-V-E-R-E-I-G-N. Those are two kind of scary sounding words. Sovereign means that he is on the top. There is no one higher than him. There is no one who is over God. That he's the one who's in charge. The buck stops with him. And omnipotent is related. It means that he's all-powerful. Omnipotent. Potent power. He is all-powerful. His power is behind the course of human events. So, verse 26, from one person God created every human nation to live on the whole earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands. In other words, ultimately, the world and everything that happens in the world revolves around God and revolves around God's plan for the world. From our perspective, the world revolves around us and what we want and what we think. Sometimes we even think that God revolves around us, or should revolve around us. That we treat God like he's some kind of cosmic room service, existing to respond to our every whim and our every desire, or at least that it's God's role to make our lives better. But this is a misperception on our part. As we used to tell our children when they were young, small, and quite demanding, we used to have a line that we repeated over and over again. You are not the center of the universe. You aren't the center of the universe. You're important. God created you, God loves you, God sustains you, God cares about you, but it's not about you. You are not the center of everything that's going on. It's not about you. It's not about providing you with a pain-free, hassle-free life. So, adjust your expectations. Fifth, Paul tells the Athenians that God makes himself immanent. Immanent. I-M-M-I-N-E-N-T. And immanent is a word that you need to know. It's a fancy word for nearby. If something is imminent, it is close, it is nearby. Verse 27, God made the nations so they would seek Him, perhaps even reach out to Him and find Him. In fact, God isn't far away from us, or from any of us. God's intention behind His creative activity is that all would turn and that all would seek Him. I really like verse 27 in the New American Standard Bible. Here's how it goes. It says, that they would seek God if perhaps they might grope for Him and find Him. Are you groping for God? He's not distant, is the idea. He's close by, so that even if you are half-heartedly groping about in the dark, you're going to come across Him. He is the God who is there. God is so close that He chose to make Himself present as a human being. I heard an oldie on the radio, Joan Osborne, remember? She would sing song, "What if God was one of us?" Do you remember that? 10 years, whatever years ago? Well, the good news is that He is one of us, and it is through the person of Jesus Christ that He makes His closeness known. The idols give us the bridge to start the conversation, the dialogue, but God Himself is not some kind of impersonal idol. When He is this close, idols are unnecessary. Idols are moot. And He's certainly not unknowable. He's not unknown. Think about it. You can know God. And that's what Paul sets out to show these Athenians. So verse 23, and this is the contemporary English version. He says, "As I was going through your city and looking at the things you worship, I found an altar with the words, 'To an unknown God.' You worship this God, but you don't really know Him. So I want to tell you about Him. That is, I want to make Him known. After 600 years of wondering, I want to reveal to you who He is and what He does." And this is our goal as well. To make known the God who appears to be unknown. The point of all this is to encourage you, to encourage us to not shy away from discussing the good news of Jesus, even when you think people are so far away that they would never get it. There are points of contact in their cultures and in their lives which become gospel bridges. Points that you maybe don't even know exist. These are bridges that show that God has made Himself known and that we can know Him when we entrust our lives to Christ. And that's the good news which we believe and which we share with the entirety of the world. So, I'm wondering who might add an insight or comment or maybe even a personal experience that you've had explaining the gospel in a distant context. Or maybe you have a question about the text or something related.
when I made the decision to give my life to Christ, I had been studying a lot of religions, especially the Eastern religions. And what finally struck me was that Jesus was there. You know, they believed that the person of Christ, that Jesus existed. And so it just hit me that he's the one. You know, he's there. He's there everywhere. And it was just like a sudden revelation.
Go right to the source.
Yeah.
I think I have the same experience as Jack experienced. And before I become a Christian, I searched God the time when I was young, and I think, and even at that time, and the Chinese government didn't allow us to have any gods. But I search, I believe I'm search. And I don't know who's the God, but I only know one thing I very, very know is God always there. Always there. And I remember when I was young and I had no friends and all my classmates, they don't want to play with me. When that time, in that situation, and I heard one voice always talk to me, "Don't worry, I am with you." And that kind of, I know you, and nobody know you, I know you, the sky know you, the earth know you, because I'm with you. I always have this song, voice in my mind. But many, many years, I don't understand what's the meaning about, until I went to the Bible study, and the Bible college, I learned about the Bible, and I learned about Jesus Christ. And this time, I remember all when I was young, I experienced, I very strong belief, God always with me. No matter I believe in Him at that time, or I don't believe Him, or I don't know Him, but He always with me.
He had been there before, and
Yeah.
you were suddenly able to put a name with
Yes, but before I search, I don't know, but eventually, He revealed to me who He is Jesus Christ, who He always with me since I was born, since I was not born yet. He's always there.